Alrighty, and we are live. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and good morning, and welcome to today's virtual press conference. My name is Ambreen Hernandez, and I serve as the Director of Operations with CAIR Houston, which is the local chapter of the nation's largest Muslim civil rights organization. So before I begin, I'd like to just remind everyone of why we are here today. On May 25th, Houston, Texas native and Minneapolis resident George Floyd was pinned face down on the ground in handcuffs by a police officer who pressed his knee against Floyd's neck for more than 8 minutes. By the time paramedics had arrived, he was pronounced dead later, and it reminds us, unfortunately, as the trial is happening today, that there are thousands of Texans across the state who are unable to tell their narratives, to tell their stories, just as George Floyd is unable to do so today. There are also thousands of Texans across the state and so many across our country who are victims of police brutality and are met with tragic deaths. To name a few right here out of Texas, as we all recall, Sandra Bland, Jorge Gonzalez, Jordan Edwards. And today, as we are here together, we hope that all of our efforts are in their honor and in their remembrance, and that we stand in true solidarity for justice for all of those that are unable to fight for themselves. So today, the George Floyd Act Support Coalition, which is composed of a growing statewide coalition of more than 70 group members, are calling for our community members to please join us in this very urgent call to action to our Texas 87th state legislator to pass the George Floyd Act. To learn more about the bill, to get resources, and to learn more about the coalition, please make sure you visit www.txgeorgefloydact.com. Also joining us in this call to action, standing in solidarity, in unity, are over 100 faith leaders from diverse faiths and regions of our state who have signed on to this letter, which is a support letter for the George Floyd Act, HB 88, and all of its components, and is to be sent to our Texas state reps. Now, without further ado, I'd like to bring up our very first speaker for today's virtual press conference, who will be sharing background information on the bill and the components and why it's so important today. Here with us, we have CAIR Houston Board President and Attorney John Floyd. So thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings to all of our guests. Thank you for joining us in solidarity today. As Ambreen mentioned, I am the current board chair for CAIR Houston. I also sit on the board for the Alliance for a New Justice System, which is a criminal justice reform advocacy organization. And we've been working on the George Floyd Act for some time to get to the point where we are today. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of legal background, just where what the bill comprised of and where we're at, so that people who need more information will know where to turn. And it's a very appropriate time for this legislation to be hitting our state legislature, given that the trial is in progress right now. I think all of us who have paid any attention to the trial at all, some of us who have experience in this field, I'm a board certified criminal lawyer in my daytime life. And so a lot of us are not surprised at what we see. We've experienced these kinds of tragedies before, or have seen them or been involved in defending against them. But I think for a lot of other people, it's come as a shock that we have this kind of brutality still permeating law enforcement across the country. And it's just been a brutal reminder to many of us. And, in some ways, a real disheartening reminder to a lot of us about the state of policing in the United States. And so it's very important that we support all efforts across the country. There's a federal George Floyd Act, and there's also a state of Texas George Floyd Act that has been filed. And so I'm just going to go over the state real quickly, and then I'll let our faith leaders take over. Chairwoman Senfronia Thompson has filed the George Floyd Act. And basically what it does is it addresses a multiple set of issues that were brought out by the death of George Floyd. Number one, it seeks to eliminate qualified immunity in the state of Texas, which for those of you who don't know, law enforcement as well as other public officials are virtually immune from civil lawsuits, including civil rights violations. So this bill would actually eliminate that type of immunity when police committed acts of violence against people in violation of their civil rights. So eliminating qualified immunity is a very important piece of this legislation because there really is nowhere else to turn. Law enforcement rarely investigates and/or charges police officers with criminal violations. And so qualified immunity, allowing people to actually sue and go through discovery, could be a very important avenue to help eliminate some of the bad behavior and hold police officers accountable when they violate people's rights. The George Floyd Act, the Texas George Floyd Act, also adds a handful of duties on police officers. Believe it or not, there is no duty in Texas for police officers to intervene when they see this kind of abuse. There is no duty that they render aid when they see fellow officers abusing individuals in the community. And so the George Floyd Act would create those duties among some others that would put an affirmative duty on police officers when they witness civil rights violations at the hands of their fellow officers, that they would have a duty to identify themselves, to intervene, and to render aid if necessary. There's also a very strict prohibition on chokeholds. Believe it or not, there is no a statute in place that prohibits that type of detention and a police technique. And so the George Floyd Act would address that issue head on by prohibiting chokeholds, and would also create de-escalation requirements, that police are trained in de-escalation and trained in warning individuals before things escalate out of control, and would also require that they use less than lethal force, except for in the most severe situations where they were actually facing, or they or someone else was facing imminent deadly force themselves. So trying to de-escalate things and take it out of kind of I guess what we see is the heat escalating in arrests a lot of times. So prohibiting chokeholds and de-escalation is very important part of the George Floyd Act. It also requires corroboration for police testimony. Many people from the Houston area are familiar with the Harding Street raid, where there was a couple of people were killed in a raid that was based on false testimony of a police officer. There was a very high profile case many years ago in Tulia, Texas, where we had an officer arrest, from what I recall, a significant portion, I think it was half of the portion of the local African-American community, and it was all based on false testimony. In fact, the governor, Perry, had to get involved and do something. Which was very rare, and he had to pardon and some of those folks who got tied up in that. But this act, and George Floyd was actually had a case where he was arrested based on testimony of the officer who gave the false testimony in the Harding Street raid. So there is a connection there. And so Senfronia Thompson, Miss T, as we call her, those who are fond of us call her, has issued, as part of the George Floyd Act, a mandate that there be corroborating evidence in addition to police testimony. And the last thing, which is very important, is that the George Floyd Act creates a disciplinary matrix, which would create basically a consistent set of disciplinary matrix for certain violations across the state, so that we would know that officers are treated fairly, as far as having hearings and having for disciplinary violations, but that also they can't avoid discipline by, as it stands right now. A lot of times law enforcement officers, when they're facing disciplinary actions, they will move jurisdictions in an attempt to avoid a disciplinary record. And so what the George Floyd Act would do was set up a standard matrix regarding discipline, certain disciplinary actions in response to certain bad conduct, and would also eliminate the availability of police officers being able to escape discipline by moving jurisdictions. It would create a statewide database as well, which would allow the public and other police agencies to check individuals and to see what their backgrounds were before they hired them. So it's a very comprehensive bill. It hits a lot of important areas that have needed to be addressed for a long time. In addition to the George Floyd Act as a piece, Representative Chairwoman Thompson has also filed each one of these individually as standalone bills, because, believe it or not, we have, well, you won't find this surprising, we have political opposition to the George Floyd Act because of the name alone. During, I guess when we had all the protests going on, a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle were supporting the protesters and police reforms and George Floyd and his family. Reluctantly, however, I guess, unfortunately, I should say, the politicians on one side of the aisle have decided that they cannot support anything now that has George Floyd's name attached to it, but for political reasons. And so as Chairwoman Thompson has decided to file these as standalone bills as well. So what I would encourage everyone to do who's interested in any more details about the act is to go to the TX George Floyd Act website. There's all the details of the bill there. I'd also encourage everyone to support the act and to reach out to their local state representatives and their state senators and let them know that how they feel about the provisions of the act. I think there's some very important legislation here that can be addressed. So thank you, Sister Umbreen, for the time. I hope that brings us up to speed, and I really look forward to hearing from our religious and spiritual leaders for their guidance.
Thank you so much for that overview, Brother John, and emphasizing how important it is to create policies that do set a platform for best practices in policing, and just providing the accountability piece that we expect from all of our institutions in order to begin finding justice for George Floyd and so many other victims across the state of Texas and in our nation. So without further ado, next up, I would love to bring on Reverend Robin Murray from Dallas, specifically Faith in Texas, who has been such a remarkable and strong supporter of the George Floyd Act Support Coalition group. Robin, floor's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ambreen. And thank you, John, for that detailed explanation. So Faith in Texas is a multi-faith, multiracial grassroots organization that unites people and communities of faith to address systemic and racial injustices, those that plague our communities. And one of the most common tenets that weaves through the diversity of our faith traditions is being accountable for affirming and protecting the inherent dignity held by all people. In part, it is the failure of that same tenet in our systems anchored in racial prejudices that actually allow the lives of George Floyd and countless others whose names have been mentioned, and those in Texas who have been devastated and ultimately stolen, those lives stolen. And so we need interventions across the state that address current pathways for law enforcement officers to be free from accountability when they do cause harm. And the George Floyd Act definitely seeks to begin that long march towards valuing and protecting people. Now, I will say, for me as an African Methodist Episcopal AME minister, I am constantly reminded of the tenets of my own faith tradition and how my denomination began. And our tradition actually began out of resistance. My people, Black people, God's created people, they were brought to this land, stolen land. They were bought, beaten, and made to be broken. But my ancestors, as they learned Christianity, the teachings of Jesus, they began to resist the lie, that the big lie that was being told to them, which is that they were created less than their counterparts, their white counterparts who shared their faith. And so they decided to leave that brand of colonizing Christianity and decided, you know, our dignity, our humanity should be valued. And there's not one group of people that should be on top. And they rallied their people and they called for a new revolutionary thing. And I think in this legislative session, we have an opportunity to do something revolutionary, to liberate oppressed people, Black, Indigenous, people of color that suffer at the hands, at times, unfortunately, by law enforcement. And these bills are, again, the first step to addressing that. And we should reimagine what safety looks like in this country. And I think that we can do it beginning in the Lone Star State of Texas. We must pass legislation, laws that prevent the murder of people, hold those folks who are accountable for these acts, and make sure that no one gets a pass just because they have a uniform. We're all human. We're all capable of frustration, fear, and anger. We're all capable of mistakes and bad days. We all have biases. Don't get me wrong. I appreciate those who seek to aid us, who put their lives on the line for us and try to proactively do their jobs with valor and fairness. But again, we are in a system, and that system that exists is a system that should be challenged, because sometimes the system mistreats certain groups of individuals, human beings. And so we have an opportunity this session to be able to make a decision to either uphold a broken system, a flawed system that is causing harm, or have the courage to do something revolutionary. And so again, as John mentioned, the George Floyd bills, they get us closer to that revolution. And I urge Texas legislators to have the courage to do that new thing, to be a part of history that says we are contributing to the type of change that will allow people to be protected, and not just any people, all people to be protected. And I even encourage everyday folks like me and you to be able to not just sit by and allow things to just happen to us, to empower ourselves and know that there is something that we can do. The website has been given. Call your representative. We show you how to do that, and we will walk with you if you need it. But I am deeply appreciative as a representative of Faith in Texas, as a representative of the AME Church, to be able to share the importance of what is happening in this legislative session right now.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Reverend Murray. So good to have you, and really appreciate your beautiful reminder of how our humanity is the thread that binds us all together, and how important it is that we move together in action to make sure that we see revolution in a way that is really productive and constructive, and leads us to a path of bringing us together again. Thank you so much for your beautiful words. Next up, I have Brother Mustafa Carroll, who is from our sister chapter, CAIR Dallas. Brother Mustafa. Oh, you have to unmute. There you go.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be unto everybody. Many thanks for allowing us to have an opportunity to speak here, and many thanks to members of the press who may be present. Today, CAIR Texas, representing the local chapters of the nation's largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization, enjoins with Faith in Texas, along with faith leaders across the state of Texas, in support of the George Floyd Act. We are also taking this opportunity once again to ask the Homeland Security and Public Safety Committee to urge the 87th legislature to pass the George Floyd Act, i.e. HB 88, and one of its sections filed as a separate bill, HB 830, that ends arrest for non-jailable offenses, previously known as the Sandra Bland Bill. The murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police represented the height of police misconduct, brutality, and murder, which are stark realities in Black and brown communities for far too long. Many watched in horror as a police officer displaying callousness and indifference placed his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes while Mr. Floyd called for his mother, pled for his life, and was choked to death. Please note, I'm the father of 4 sons, 3 grandsons, 2 granddaughters, 2 great-granddaughters, and 1 great-grandson. This incident and incidents of police misconduct caused Black parents to fear for their lives and, more importantly, the lives of their children. Consequently, as Reverend Mary has previously stated, the Black community lacks a sense of safety. Many find themselves in the unenviable position of having to explain to their children how to survive the simplest of police encounters to ensure that they return home alive. Additionally, when police misconduct does occur, there is no assurance of accountability due to qualified immunity. For the aforementioned reasons, we urge the 87th legislators to pass the George Floyd Act, HB 88, again, and the non-jailable bills, HB 830, to assure reforms to help reduce and hopefully eliminate police misconduct in Texas, restore trust and imbue strong relationships between police and the communities they serve, and to provide for a sense of safety in Black and brown communities and for police officers as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brother Mustafa. Next up, we have Imam Dr. Omer Suleiman, who is the founder and president of Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research and is also a resident scholar at Valley Ranch Islamic Center and professor at Southern Methodist University. Assalamu alaikum, Imam. How are you doing today? And thank you so much for joining us.
Good. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you all. I'm here to listen and to support more than to speak, so I'll keep my comments very brief. As I was listening to the introduction, it was very eye-opening to me that some people backed off of this bill because of the name of George Floyd, yet those same politicians would have rushed to the street naming ceremony of Botham Jean even as they were participating in undermining the call for justice for Botham as that trial of Amber Geiger was unfolding. And so I think that just tells you everything that you need to know about how our victims are dehumanized even in death and used in bankrupt politics. And so it's a shame that this is even debatable. I think that one of the things that we see often, in fact, we always see in the wake of the victimization of people like George Floyd, is the predictable character assassination and then making the victim culpable in their own death. And that is done through finding every loophole, technical loophole, to justify the action of the officer who is supposed to be protecting human life. And so, he turned too fast, or this is considered resisting arrest, or shouldn't have said that, or reached in this way, or reached in that way. It puts all of the blame and the entire onus on the victim, who is no longer around to defend themselves, and completely absolves the officer of any responsibility, whereas it's the officer that is supposed to be supremely trained. It is the officer that is supposed to have a higher duty to society. And so reducing the loopholes and the technicalities, implementing procedures and training and police reform and response, these should not be debatable issues. They should be very obvious to us all, but unfortunately, as we said, Black life is politicized and Black death is politicized, unfortunately, in a way that hinders progress. And so I support this act of legislation, and I support all the faith leaders that are here, all of the faith organizations that are here, that are speaking out against such brutal routine practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we thank you also for signing the letter of support and being here with us today. So thank you once again. And next up, I would like to introduce Rabbi Oren Hayon, who is based out of here in Houston, Texas. Rabbi.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be with you this morning. As Amberine said, my name is Rabbi Oren Hayon. I am very grateful to be a part of this gathering this morning, this group of people of faith and people of conscience. And I'm particularly grateful for the leadership of my own denomination, the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, whose commitment to the Jewish ethical tradition helps mobilize our community to advocate for social justice. But the reason that I'm here specifically this morning is because my spiritual tradition holds that any sustainable society has to preserve at its core a commitment to fairness and to equality, and that the leaders of our communities, especially those who oversee the enforcement of the law and the exercise of justice, have to take extra scrupulous care to grant all people equal justice under the law. So we know that that is an expression of our American democracy, but it's also a deeply spiritual commitment. And I also want to acknowledge that it is very often easier said than done. And to make progress toward equal justice sometimes takes years of commitment, and it sometimes entails considerable suffering to make progress. I want to share a Jewish teaching with you this morning, a teaching from my scriptural tradition, which you'll recognize if your faith background includes the Hebrew Bible. So in the book of Deuteronomy, the Hebrew of the text includes the familiar phrase tzedek, tzedek tirdof in Hebrew, which means justice, justice shall you pursue. So I want to share with you an interpretation of that teaching that comes from my rabbinic tradition. The Jewish sages taught that the reason the word justice is repeated twice in that verse is that it's actually referring to two separate commandments. That there is one commandment to seek justice when it's easy to do so, when justice is close at hand, when justice is easily accessible and doesn't take a lot of effort, but that there is a separate and distinct commandment to seek justice when it's hard, to make justice happen when it's elusive, and to look for it when it's difficult to find. The legislation that we're talking to you about today is going to be hard. The work we also know of law enforcement is hard. It requires quick thinking and responsiveness and quick decision making. The work of law enforcement comes with tools and techniques that hold great strength and power, but also require the capacity for gentleness and compassion. And this legislative work is hard too. To advocate for equal justice under the law is difficult. It makes strenuous demands of voters and legislators, and sometimes making our way into unfamiliar territory legislatively can feel scary. And that's why we talk about this work in scripture and in prayer, and not just in the halls of our legislature or the academies of our law enforcement agencies, because we are here together, bound up in the mutual understanding that faith helps us make our way through uncertainty and fear, and allows us to stay focused on the work of fairness and justice. I'm here speaking to you as a Jew and as a rabbi, but every faith tradition that I'm aware of teaches you that if your ethics begin and end at the doorway of your church, or your synagogue, or your mosque, or your temple, then your ethics aren't worth very much at all. As you've already heard, this group of speakers this morning represents a diverse coalition of leaders and organizers, clergy and teachers. We are people of different faiths, and I know that there are people of no faith with us this morning as well. There is a lot that we disagree about this morning, theologically and ideologically, but As Americans and as Texans, we share a common commitment to equal justice under the law. We must, and we have to fight to advocate for it, even when it's difficult, even when it's complicated, even when it requires making difficult and dramatic changes to the status quo. As you heard from John earlier, this legislation that we're talking to you about is going to require a lot of work. It's going to be hard. And all of us will be asked to use our strength, our influence, our relationships, and our time to help do our part to bend the arc of the moral universe toward the equitable administration of policing and justice, to move our state toward a heightened appreciation of the full humanity and dignity of all Texans, especially communities of color, here, across Texas, and across our country. It is hard work, but it is necessary and it is holy. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be with you this morning, and I know that I will be grateful for your support and your time and effort to make this work successful as we go forward together. And my prayers will be that the hard work we'll do together will continue to flourish and bring all of us a bit closer to liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
God willing. Thank you so much, Rabbi, for being with us and all of your support and in this effort. Thank you. Next up, we have Reverend Michael Seifert from Brownsville. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for this holy moment, actually. I am talking from the Rio Grande Valley in the tip of Texas. I've worked here for 27 years as a Catholic priest in some of the poorest parts of this state of Texas. A year ago, this coming Monday on April 12th, a young man was arrested for a misdemeanor offense. He was outside having barbecue during a COVID quarantine. His neck was broken. He was put into the county drunk tank. And after 3 months of harrowing surgeries and desperate life-saving attempts, he died. Completely unnecessary. It leaves one without words. So that's coming up a year from that. If the George Floyd Act had been in place, this wouldn't have happened. His family would not still be sitting there wondering, what did we do wrong? Perhaps the police officers as well would have had somebody step in and say, no, stop that. This is wrong, let's go back. In the Christian tradition, we have in our churches images of a crucifixion. Jesus of Nazareth was put on a cross and essentially was dying of asphyxiation in agony, put on the cross by the state police. He was an inconvenience and he was a poor brown person. The Roman law, which was supposed to be the end all of a good society, failed that man, failed his community, and left us with a martyr. In our traditions, the martyr is the one who witnesses to injustice as a call to justice. We need martyrs, unfortunately, but we all live towards that day when that need is no longer necessary. It is hard work, but the work that needs to be done has names on it. Two names I'd like to mention would be State Senator Chuy Hinojosa, Jorge Gonzalez, the man that was killed a year ago, is his constituent. And Senator Hinojosa has an extraordinary sense of leadership, and we are counting on him to push this bill through, as well as Terry Canales, who is the state rep for whom Jorge Gonzalez was his constituent as well. We need to call them, remind them, help them understand that this is hard work and it's not going to be popular with everyone else, but it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing for Texas. And so I appreciate this group pulling us together from all across this very large state, and would like to finish reminding folks that it is the far out rural areas that most need the rule of law. Houston's got great media, we don't. Jorge Gonzalez died and it basically disappeared. We need law to help us live the right and holy way.
God willing. Thank you all so much for being here with us again and all of your support in making sure that we are truly standing in solidarity with one another for justice and emphasizing the importance of action as we see all of the injustice that have taken place leading up to this point. It is such a historical moment in our history, and Texas is in a very unique position to make a very, very strong progressive change in a way that can really help create a better future for our communities across the board, God willing. So without further ado, I would like to end this program and open it up for any questions. I'm going to head right over to the comment section of this video and see if we do have any inquiries there. If not, I do welcome the opportunity for media to please contact CAIR Houston Faith in Texas, as well as any of our speakers here today, if they would like any commentary on this legislation. So with that in mind, I do not see anything, and I will conclude this program. Thank you all so much, Jazakallah khair, and may God be with you all. Peace and blessings.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
You all. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you all.
Right.